This is the return of Captain Kirk.
An alien object of unbelievable destructive power is less than 3 days away from this planet.
Mr. Spock.
I offer my services as science officer.
Dr. McCoy. Scotty. And joining them on their mission, Commander Will Decker and Navigator Ilea.
I'm sorry.
That you left Delta 4? Or that you didn't even say goodbye?
So say what you will about Star Trek the Motion Picture. They definitely rolled out Hollywood's red carpet for Star Trek. Robert Wise was not some random pick. Robert Wise was a pedigreed director. He's responsible for one of my favorite classic horror movies, The Haunting, the adaptation of The Haunting of Hill House with Shirley Jackson. Big fan.
Fantastic. Andromeda Strain.
Yeah.
West Side Story.
West Side Story is a
Oscar
huge
winner
musical, Best Picture winner. This guy is no slouch. But just because you're an amazing director doesn't necessarily mean that you were born to do a Star Trek
Or that
movie.
you've ever seen it.
Well, my impression, and again, I come in as not a fan, is that this guy saw 2001 and sort of said, me too. Right? Like, he wanted to make a beautiful science fiction epic spectacle. Mm-hmm. And since they were consciously changing the tone of the movie, of the original TV show, pardon me, that seemed like the right direction to go. And in true to form, especially when you take a TV show to a film, you have to up the stakes. It's no longer just one adventure on the bridge of the Enterprise. The world is at stake. Everything has to get bigger. So I get the intention, but I will admit that I found the pace of this to be very, very slow, and that I was confused and maybe even irritated by the fact that, frankly, the two main characters of the movies are none of the main characters of the core cast of Star Trek. I suffer from insomnia. I have a really hard time sleeping most of the time. And we watched Star Trek the Motion Picture at my friend's house, at Paxton's house, where we're recording this now. And for the last 20 minutes of this movie,
Could not keep your eyes open.
I was having a real fucking hard time keeping my eyes open. And I rewatched it again at home because I wanted to get clarity.
Okay, good, because the last 20 minutes is the movie.
That's the
Right?
There had been some whiskey drinking, and if I recall, the thermostat was pretty high.
It was hot.
It was swelteringly hot.
It was hot. That's true.
But you'd also watch 2 hours of Star Trek 1, which is a...
I don't fall asleep during movies,
like
and
a
I don't
sleeping
fall
pill.
asleep in other people's houses. Like, it was pretty unprecedented. And I watched it again, like I said, at my house. I felt a little dopey while I was watching it, but in the interest of being brutally honest, I would at this point only recommend Star Trek the Motion Picture as a sleep aid. I don't have a lot of affection for it. I mean, there is, the Enterprise porn that we talked about when we watched the movie where you get the slow pan around the Enterprise.
Yep.
And if I grew up loving the Enterprise,
Then you'd give a shit.
then I would give a shit. But I just wanted them to get to the ship. No. I like what they were going for. I like the presentation, but this doesn't feel like Star Trek to me. It just doesn't.
Well, they're not on a trek yet.
I
There
didn't
is a
mention the
reason.
plot, but I think I've mentioned enough that I can safely put this blood-soaked ball in your guys'
Sure.
Fair enough. Now, just let me frame this for a second. It's 1979.
Yep.
8. Wasn't it 8?
It was released in 79.
Oh, okay.
There is a whole generation of people who grew up 10 years earlier watching Star Trek. VHSs don't exist. The reruns were in syndication, but people hadn't seen Star Trek for a long time. There was a nation of people out there who grew up loving the Enterprise and wanted to see it on the screen. So, I know you don't feel that way, but there was
A lot of people did.
There's a reason that movie made more money than any other Star Trek movie to date. Right, adjusted for modern day by a long shot, right? A lot of people wanted to go see that movie. A lot of people didn't want to go see it again, but they wanted to see it the first time because they wanted to see the Enterprise. Secondly, we watched, in preparation for this review, the director's cut,
Which
that
is
has
longer.
that huge, long, sleep-inducing section where they're flying into the gas cloud is 11 minutes
There's about
longer.
12 minutes of footage in the movie
that
that
was
is all that
rightfully
kind of
on the
stuff.
cutting room floor when it first hit the wall.
So I
in
typically
79.
wouldn't have seen that unless we were watching the deluxe edition.
And it's
Okay.
possible
We treated you to the longer version.
Thank you.
And it's debatable, I maybe regret that decision, because if we're stacking the movies and we're specifically not talking, we got into this when we did Apocalypse Now Redux,
Right.
where it altered my position. My ranking was affected by the fact that we were rating the Redux version and not the real version.
Well, I can credit this as the director's cut, so there's no confusion amongst the trophies.
It would probably change my rank. That
Right.
extra 11 minutes of footage might. I don't know. It would depend on the day.
It wouldn't for me because, like I said, this movie exists in the last 15, 20 minutes
Right.
of the screenplay.
But it's
So-
over 2 hours.
But you
that's
have
the
to
problem.
sit there to get there,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Literally, the movie's 2 hours and 25 minutes or something, right? Or is it 2 hours and 15? I don't
It's 2 hours too long.
So you guys are on board with this.
132.
Like, I don't mean to be super mean about it, and like I say, I praise the ambition, and it was like, at the time, the idea of these space scopes and these like scenes of spaceships were not as commonplace in theaters as we see now. I said the same thing when we talked about 2001, all those slow pans over the spaceships. I think when you were first sitting down in the theater, when it was a brand new movie, you'd be drooling over that shit.
Mm-hmm.
And we're not as impressed by that now. I think that part of the problem might just be time itself. But
part of the problem is somebody who has done a lot of editing. That movie, most of the pacing problems of that movie could be solved by re-editing it. I bet there are some fan edits of the motion picture that are far more digestible. And one of the big problems with the movie, and why it is on the bottom end of all of three of our lists, I'm sure when we get there it'll be toward the bottom end of the list for everybody, is that it isn't a movie script, right? Jaron, you said it has elements of Gene Roddenberry's script that wasn't even originally a Star Trek script.
It was a film feature script. He just tried to sell it as something else.
Yeah, and it also has elements of a script that was written for Phase 2, the proposed but failed CBS revival show that they were going to do a new run where the Enterprise was on a new 5-year mission.
Yeah.
And my understanding is that the episode that was going to be the pilot for that was taken. The Decker character, the one who's sort of in competition with Kirk for command of the Enterprise, was he to be the new captain or a new first officer for Kirk?
I don't know the specifics.
He comes
about
out of
those
one of the
characters.
scripts. Several of those older scripts and characters were mined to make this movie that ends up feeling like there's enough story with the whole V'ger, right? We haven't outlined the plot,
Right,
but
it's another
there's
one of
enough
these-
story there to fill a 45-minute episode of television, and it's 2 hours and 12 minutes long.
the plot is basically a familiar thing, especially when we're talking about the movies. A heretofore unknown but ultra-powerful force shows up out of nowhere from the universe, seeming to demand or need something, and there's a riddle that needs to be solved, and everybody's
And
like,
it's
And
headed
the
for
Enterprise
Earth.
is the only ship in the quadrant.
and we have, I can't even, here's a bad sign. What's the name of the main character, the guy who's just been put in charge?
Captain Decker.
Decker, yeah. Again, I can't even keep the guy's name in it. Like, he, to me, is the main character of this movie. His arc is probably the most full of any of the characters. He and this bald chick.
His beginning and his end constitute more of a journey, I think, than Kirk's
any
arc,
other
certainly.
anyone. And that decision for me is confusing. I think that you guys talking about the fact that it was mined from a different screenplay might actually crack the code on that for me, because they couldn't kill Kirk, right? So they couldn't put Kirk in that role.
Well, and there's
Right.
stuff in this screenplay to give you an idea of how there were poor decisions made throughout the making of the movie as far as what to cut and what not to cut. They shoot all of this V'ger footage where they're flying through the being, and meanwhile there are interesting little character details about Decker that don't make it to the screen. Decker is the son of Kirk's best friend, or one of his close friends, Commodore Decker,
Who's in the show.
He's
Who's
a
in the original
character
series.
in one of the best episodes of the series called The Doomsday Machine, and Decker, Commodore Decker ends up, after having some faltering courage, very selflessly sacrificing himself to save the Enterprise, etc., etc.
Well, not really.
Well,
He sort of dies in disgrace after his whole crew is marooned on a planet and dies.
he at least attempts to die courageously, and he
Yeah,
teaches
he
them a
just fails.
lesson of how to kill the thing without inadvertently
Yes.
solves the riddle for them. That's by the
Nerds.
wayside. Anyway, that sort of thing might help Decker make sense to a viewer. As like, okay, so this is the son of Kirk's old friend. That's
Right.
all you need to know. That would take 2 seconds to inject that into the movie, and suddenly we might understand a bit more about why Decker's
but
even
instead
there in the
12
first
minutes
place.
of flashy lights and mist and more lights.
Well,
and
that feels like at least a little wiggle of fan service. And like I know that you can overdo fan service, but basically we had the characters from the original Star Trek TV show in an adventure unlike anything that they ever been in before, to which they were supporting players in.
Mm-hmm.
Right. They get the beginnings of
Except
arcs,
for Spock.
but they don't really get to finish them.
Yeah.
Like at the beginning of the movie, Kirk's wrestling with old age, feeling like he's over the hill. That's potentially interesting for a character.
But he doesn't get that story arc really until Star Trek II when it starts.
It's reintroduced in exactly the same way.
But they decided
in
to
Star
actually
Trek
follow
2,
it
but
through.
it goes to the end of the film.
As is so often the case with Star Trek, the only core character of the main trio of Kirk, Spock, McCoy. Spock is a main character in Star Trek the Motion Picture. Right? V'ger speaks to him across time and space. He comes back from his Vulcan studies and rejects all Vulcan philosophy because he has to go and talk to this He realizes, like, I have feelings about this. I can't accept this honor of completing this training because, look, I'm having feelings about this being across the galaxy and I have to go chase that. And he actually has a character journey. He dies and is reborn in a certain way, or just about dies, right? He faces infinity. All of these things happen to Spock, and all Kirk does really is have a cock measuring contest with a guy who ends up dying.
Stand around. And Spock also, the climax turns on Spock's understanding of V'ger.
Mm-hmm.
And as was common in the TV show, his strengths, it all sort of comes to bear for Kirk to then decide what to do.
Right.
So
probably the best scene in the movie is Spock in recovery after he's encountered and mind melded with V'ger, and he's just waking up and Kirk is talking to him in sickbay, and Spock is very emotional. He's smiling and laughing, and the interesting thing about that scene is that, is it you who told me this, Jaron?
I don't know.
Nimoy and Shatner made that decision for Spock to be emotional there together.
Oh,
they
really?
didn't. Yeah, well, Wise didn't know fucking dick about the characters, right? He hadn't watched Star Trek before he got the job.
Yeah, they would get together in their trailer and like decide how to change the script.
And Nimoy and Kirk were bored, and I think Nimoy and Shatner, I think they realized they were making an utterly boring movie that didn't have anything to do with Kirk and Spock, and they're like, we can have this interesting little arc between the two of them where Spock's eyes are open to the whole universe for a minute, and his reaction is very emotional, which makes sense because Spock's half human. He spends most of his energy repressing emotion. Right? He's the most repressed guy ever.
He realizes how lucky he is to be able to have access to emotion, whether he chooses to deny it or not. It's within his ability.
And all of that stuff is about 3
stronger.
layers under the surface of what is more or less a boring movie. But to finish up the plot synopsis, we never finish. We get to the end, the super being that's threatening the Earth turns out to be Voyager 6, which right now is an Earth probe that gets sent out in our time or in the late 20th century.
Yeah, there was no Voyager 6.
There was no Voyager 6, but Voyager is right now leaving the solar system as we speak. It's the furthest object from here. And in '79, it was assumed, I suppose, that the Voyager program
would
continue.
have a bunch.
Yeah, that's right. So we sent this machine out. It encountered a race of machines, became super intelligent, and came home to contact its creator, which
to return all that information.
That's right. And in trying to complete its mission, threatens to wipe out human civilization.
But they don't.
Then Decker fucks the probe, and it has a giant space orgasm.
Everything up till that point in the movie is basically the same concept. I forget the name of the episode, but there's an episode in the original series that's basically that same thing. This probe that has collected all the data it possibly can.
It's called the Changeling.
Is that the one?
Yeah.
And it wants to return the information.
Yeah.
So they just sort of grab that,
but made it bigger. Yeah.
Yeah, and then added on what doesn't happen in that episode, as far as I recall, where they have this theoretical exploration of what a machine life form is missing that would allow it to continue to learn.
Mm-hmm.
And it's pretty hokey, but Kirk's like, what V'ger needs is a human quality, our ability to leap beyond logic.
It's trying to learn.
So that's why it wants to merge with its creators, so that it can be more than just what it is.
Yeah.
And be able to explore
recognizes
dimensions and
that-
keep learning and blah, blah, blah.
It recognizes that one of the things that the carbon units, which is what it calls us, one of the things that the carbon units do is to merge with one another, and it feels the need to merge in order to... It understands everything else in the universe except what it means to become one with some other being.
Right.
So it wants to do that. It wants to get jiggy with it. Now, if you need any final nail in the coffin of why Decker shouldn't be in the movie, is at the end, like I said, he solves the problem by joining physically with V'ger's avatar. V'ger creates this human out of... Ilea is a lieutenant on the Enterprise who's introduced because, God forbid, we use a character from Star Trek, right? We better introduce some new ones. She's kidnapped by V'ger, made into his avatar and his sort of probe. And we interact with V'ger through her, and so do all of the crew members. Decker wins by fucking Ilea. Yeah. Why isn't that Kirk? That's what Kirk does, right?
Because
he
by
fucks
this
his way
point,
across the galaxy. Is my point? Is that here you have Star Trek being solved with some chivalry and a deep dickin', and it's not Kirk doing it.
Roddenberry kill Kirk, right? They probably in their hearts wanted a franchise, and the whole thing would be incredibly different if they started the show by killing off Kirk.
I'm not saying they should kill Kirk. I'm just saying Kirk didn't even get to do any James Bonding. He didn't get to have any love making.
The only real contribution he makes to the whole movie is at the end. He's the one who says what V'ger needs is this human quality.
And Decker
he wants to merge.
And
so then Decker says,
the original series,
Ilea, I'll go merge with her.
And Kirk throughout the original series is the voice saying that in the classic cock versus Spurk, Kirk versus Spock dynamic of human versus logic, right?
Yeah, they all become greater than the sum of their parts.
That's right, and Kirk is always arguing that it's human flaws that make humans
that will win the day,
able to do the thing, blah blah blah, and that's Roddenberry. That's Roddenberry's philosophy all over the place, right? Mm-hmm. And hey, it works. It makes for some good TV and for some. It
saves the day at the end of the movie.
Yeah. I keep going back to the 2001 influence. That's what I kind of feel like this was trying to be a loftier, true blue sci-fi Star Trek.
It was certainly an overt repudiation of the zippy, Star Wars-y, flying around and, really high...
wasn't much of a trek.
They wanted to blow your mind. They didn't want to necessarily just blow shit up.
They recognized that one of the things that people loved about the original series was that it was intellectual sometimes. It wasn't always intellectual. And sometimes when it tried to be intellectual, it was stupid. The episode you mentioned where they run into the beings who are...
half black and half
white. Yeah,
white.
it's basically... Sneetches? Is that the doctor's...
Yellow-bellied Sneetches.
It's basically Sneetches in space. Yeah. And other times when it tries to be high-minded, you get some, pretty incredible stuff in Star Trek.
I think that the pendulum was just sort of swinging to the other extreme. We have the crazy, wacky extreme of the TV show to the sort of more moderate, sort of serious sci-fi of the motion picture. Mm-hmm. Halfway, I think we're going to meet in the middle when we come to part 2.
I think
neither Star Trek nor Star Wars are science fiction, personally. You said that you have a hard time putting Star Wars in the science fiction camp. I say Star Wars is clearly just space fantasy. Right. It might as well be Lord of the Rings. It's just set in space with ships instead of riding around on wolves and swords, all of that sort of thing. Star Trek is... Well, the show in particular was pitched as Wagon Train to the Stars, and that's what it is. It's a space western with elements of sci-fi hidden in it, because there was no way to overtly put science fiction on TV.
But generally what I like about Star Trek is that they sneak the sci-fi in. I mean, yeah, we're about explosions, but we might sneakily try to blow your mind underneath.
Yeah. There's definitely sci-fi in Star Trek, but there's almost no science fiction in Star Wars. Star Trek, though, is just sort of a matrix in which sometimes good sci-fi stories are told, and other times they're just very, especially by the time we get to the next generation, but even in the early stories, they're often just fairly simple morality tales, right, or allegorical stories, right, that sort of thing.
In the end, it's a huge universe, really. It can be used to tell any kind of story, but typically I associate it more with sci-fi. I know that we're going to get into much more familiar sort of action space territory right away here, but it feels more sci-fi somehow to me than Star Wars ever will.
There was no staff of writers, right? They took submissions from all sorts of people, and So you can almost look at the original series as like a weekly sci-fi magazine where people take, I'm sure a lot of writers took concepts they had for other stories and rewrote them to use Star Trek characters. And so depending on the writer, some weeks you would have a really sci-fi heavy episode, and some weeks you'd have Balance of Terror that was a submarine fight in space. And it was a great episode, but there's no science fiction happening. It's just happening in space.
It just happens to be, yeah.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you guys want to say about the motion picture?
Yeah, I just want to throw out my theory for why it is terrible.
Okay. I was expecting more fight back on this, so I'm actually kind of happy.
I think it just...
It's terrible in context
Star Trek
of these
has
6 movies. But.
Star Trek, even now, like in the rebooted universe that exists in cinemas, sadly, is it's most terrible when it's trying to serve masters outside of what everyone who's created good Star Trek knows makes it the best, which is the characters,
right?
The chemistry, the utilizing the characters in the way that they've already been proven to be best used.
Right.
And this movie is guilty of completely disregarding that for the most part.
Kirk, Spock, McCoy have like 2 scenes, and
when they do, the movie comes to life a little bit, barely.
Yeah.
Like, they do their best, but the stuff they have to
and
say
even
is
then
ridiculous.
it only comes to life for people who already know and care about the characters. Somebody who'd never seen Star
Yeah,
Trek,
it gets reanimated.
those scenes are not going to go, oh, this is getting interesting. Those scenes get interesting because we know those characters and because those
we
actors
just stop
are
falling
talented.
asleep at that point while we watch it.
We're like,
Right.
oh, this chemistry is this reminds me of Star Trek or something.
These are the people we came here to see.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, I just wanted to make that point.
Point
Because
made.
I feel like it's very... Like, the same could be said for why the new movies are terrible as well.